What's up, you phonies, and how's it going? And welcome to another video. Today we're gonna make a smoky dude. I made this effect last week, and as you can see, it looks pretty cool how this guy is dancing and he's just smoking it all up. And to be honest, this is way easier to make than it seems, but it is very heavy on your computer. So you can come along with me. I'm going to show you how to do that, what to look out for, and which settings to use. And hopefully your computer is going to be strong enough to render this out. Let's get started. I used an animation from Mixamo. Mixamo is a website, is by Adobe, and they have a bunch of cool animations you can use for that kind of effect. In my last one, I used a hip-hop dance. In my next one, I'm going to use this cool sneaky walking animation. I think that's gonna be looking very cool when this guy is smoking. That actually got me thinking, you know the game Would You Rather? This one reminds me of my favorite Would You Rather. So I'm gonna ask you now, you can let me know in the comments which one would you rather. So, would you rather always having to sneak like this, doesn't matter where you have to go, you always have to sneak like that, or you always have to sprint like this, it doesn't matter where you go. So if you go grocery shopping, to the bus, wherever, you always have to sprint like this? Or would you rather to sneak? Let me know in the comments below. So in today's tutorials we're gonna use this sneaking animation. It is pretty cool. And as the character, I picked this one because it's just a mannequin and he doesn't even have necessarily like geometry I don't want or use. I just want a person, as simple as possible, so that's why I took this mannequin, but you can pick whatever you want. So once you pick your animation and your character, then click on download, adjust your frame rate, whatever frame rate you are using, FBX, and then hit on download. Now we are in Blender. I use Blender 3.5, but you can basically use whatever Blender you want, but it should be older than 2.9. I have my scene set up that I have two viewports, one where I can play around with and one where I'm looking actually through the camera. It's set to cycles. Cycles definitely is going to look better, but Eevee should work too if your computer is not strong enough. Then I have another one for my notes, which is going to be useful later. So the first thing I do is I import my FBX. This is the walking, and there you go. This is my guy in Blender just sneaking. Okay, there's a few things we have to do before we start with the smoke simulation. I see where he is starting. I'm gonna make a plane with Shift A, mesh, and make a plane. I extend this plane, Control A, and apply the scale. So just for my collision, which is going to be important in a second. Okay, now it's time to make the smoke. We click on our mesh, we select our mesh. This is our mesh here. And now I click on Object, and under Quick Effects, hit Quick Smoke. Now a few things happen. We have this big box around our mesh. This is our domain, and nothing is going to happen smoke-wise outside our domain. So we need to adjust our domain to the size we need it to be. The cool thing about the smoke effect is you can make an adaptive domain, so the domain is going to shrink or grow depending on where the smoke is going. But I prefer not doing that, but you're going to see about that later. So when I go to frame number 1 and play it, we can already see smoke is being generated. It's pretty cool. It is very dark because I have no lights in my scene, but that's okay for now. So first let's talk about this domain here. You want this domain to be as small as possible, as big as necessary. Because if you just make it super big, like everything is going to be rendered, it's going to take way longer to render your scene, and the resolution is going to go down. You see this little cube here? This is basically our resolution of our smoke right now. So we want this to be as small as possible. That means I go in edit mode, I select those vertices down here, bring it, and we go to side view, bring it to 0. This is where our ground is. Now, I also need to decide, do I want my smoke to be rising the way it is right now, or do I want it to be falling to the ground? In my particular case, the guy in the dancing club, his smoke was settling on the ground. And I'm gonna do the same thing in this effect. So I don't need as much domain on top, just a little bit in case a little smoke is being blown up, but that's basically it. So now I'm checking how far is he going. So this is basically the last frame where he's gonna be at. So I'm gonna extend the domain to the front. So you can see how the smoke is being stuck on the ceiling because again, it's going up and it can't exit our domain. That's why it's being stuck here, but that's okay. Again, we're making the smoke fall down. There's a few settings you need to know. What we're working with here is a fluid simulation. So we have a fluid inflow on our mesh. That means fluid is getting blown out from our mesh, from our animation. There's a few different settings you don't need to touch, but the two main important ones is geometry and inflow. If I set it to geometry, we just generate smoke once from the geometry and it's blown up once. So it's not keep making more, it's basically one burst. That's not what we want here. We want inflow. The most important setting in our mesh fluid simulation is sampling subframes, because that basically generates more information in between the movements. If that's set to 0, that means number of additional samples to take between frames to improve quality of fast moving flows. That means if our guy is moving very fast, you want to increase this number. If our thing is not moving at all or very slow, you want to keep this number small. The higher the number, the longer it's going to take to render. Since our character is moving slowly, but it's still moving, I'm going to set this to 2. And that's basically it here. You have additional settings like initial velocity. If you want to burst the smoke in any direction, you can do that with initial velocity. In our case, I don't want to do that. I just want it to drop. Our more important settings are in the domain, smoke domain settings. There's a billion different settings you can select and change, but I'm going to walk you through the most important ones so you don't have to waste too much time on that. So this here is a very important one, the resolution division. On default, it's set to 32. If you crank this number, I always like the number of 2, so I always like to double those. So right now it's 64. You can already tell it takes way longer to render, and eventually, yes, you are gonna have to do that. But in the beginning, just to get through all the settings, keep this number small, maybe even smaller than that, 16. So the border collisions means if I want the smoke to collide with the borders of my my domain, then I just have to select those on. For example, I turn on top. Now the smoke is going to collide with the top. It's not going to go anywhere. If I don't want any border collision, if I just want to have the smoke rise and rise into infinity, then I click on adaptive domain. It's going to take longer to render, but now you can see that the domain is growing in every direction depending on where the smoke is going. Okay, under gas, there's a few very important settings here. So we have the heat and the buoyancy density, if that's how you pronounce it, I don't know. Those basically mean if those numbers are positive, the smoke is going to go up. If those numbers are negative, the smoke is going to go down. And like I said before, I want it to go down. So I go -1 here, and let's say -2 on the heat. The lower the number, the more it's going to drop. So now when we play this, you can see the smoke is already going to the ground. I'm just going to add a light real quick so we can actually see what's going on, but I'm going to talk about light later. So that's what it looks like right now. Obviously not like much, but we're going to get there very soon. We go back to our gas here, so those values are great. Velocity is also a very interesting one. I would keep this number very small, but you can definitely add some. It's basically the amount of turbulence and rotation in the smoke, so it's always good to have some randomness going on. But you're gonna see the details more once I crank up the resolution, but that's fine for now. A very good one is dissolve. I always like to use that. When you hit dissolve and play it, it basically dissolves the smoke through time, which is a good thing, so it's not gonna get too far. But I also like to increase this number. So my animation is, for example, going to be 200 frames long, and I want to have the dissolve for 200 frames. So it slowly dissolves over time, which is nice. So we can ignore noise and fire. You can play around with those noise settings, what they do. But in my experience, it doesn't really increase the quality of your render too much, so I would keep it off, but just play around with it so you see what it's actually doing. Okay, here are our cache settings. Here you can select the folder where you want to bake your your simulation, and then right now the type is on replay. To actually bake your simulation, to watch it in full resolution, you have to click on replay but select all. Here you can select the start and end frame. Let's keep it small for now so the render is faster. And now when I bake it, you see my computer is rendering the first 100 frames of my simulation. And again, the reason why it doesn't look like actual smoke is just like a black cloud, because the resolution is so high. You see this cube again here, this little small cube, it's pretty big, so that means every smoke particle has this size. So by increasing the number here under resolution, this smoke is going to become smaller and detailed. We can make this comparison, we see what it looks like right now. And now I'm going to free my bake, increase this number, let's say 256. Now it's going to take longer, but I'm going to bake it again. You see how long that takes now? And because the baking is going to take so much longer now, you have to really pick your battles and only bake when you think, okay, this is a good time to bake it in a high resolution. If you're not ready yet, keep the resolution small on 64 at max, maybe 128, but then you don't waste too much time waiting for the bake. And every time you wonder, oh, in the beginning it's way faster than later, it's because more and more smoke is being generated. That means in the beginning it's 100 particles, but the longer the animation goes, the more particles you have. So it doesn't need to bake 100 particles, for example, it's going to be 105, 110, 150, 200, and so on. It's going exponentially up. That's why the bake is going to go longer throughout time. So when the first 10% are done within a second, don't be surprised if the rest is going to take way longer. But in order to have a photorealistic smoke, you definitely need to increase the number by a lot. 256 usually looks good. Higher is always better, but eventually you don't have to go higher anymore. So find your happy medium where you think, okay, your simulation looks good. And that is true for all of the simulations. When you make water, for example, here I have a video where you can learn how to make liquid simulations. It works the same way. Smoke is usually a little lighter on the computer than liquid, for example, but basically it's the same principle. Great, the bake is done. It took only 5 or 10 minutes, but now we can already see how more detailed our smoke is, how it's falling from him, and that's basically the result you want. The problem now is it's not bouncing off from the ground. And the reason for that is that our ground plane here, it also has to be a simulation object. It has to be a collision object, basically. But for that, we would need to render it again, and it's again going to take a while. But let's just see what we have for now. So we see how the smoke is really dropping from every finger separately. It's very cool. And that's basically what we want. Unfortunately, we watch it in full time. If I try, you can see it takes a long time to watch, but it already gives you a very good idea how it's gonna look. Now, for example, if we want the smoke to be more dense, we can go here, play with our material. This is my node setup. If you don't have it, you can click on this little thing and go to shader editor. That's what it is. Now when I increase the density, for example, right now it's 5, let's do 20, you see it's way denser now. Let's go crazy here, let's do 100, it's even more dense. So I'm gonna need way more light to actually see through it. So I have one light here. If I increase the light here by, let's say, 1000, it looks pretty epic, doesn't it? But now we need to solve our problem with the collision. That means we click back on our domain, go to our physics properties, and it always hurts to do that because we just spend so much time baking it, but we have to free it all. Now it's all gonna disappear. We need to make our ground and collision object. So we click on it, go on physics properties, and don't go on collision. This is not the right collision. This is a collision for rigid bodies and whatnot. We need it to be a fluid also. Under type, it is not a flow, it's not a domain, because our mesh here is the flow. Our domain here is the domain. The ground here has to be an effector. Now here it's set to collision, that's perfect. Now when we bake it, the smoke should interact with our ground. And maybe to see it better, we're gonna make a few more. Just a few cubes, so we can see that it's also interacting with them. Also make it a fluid, effector. And now we're just gonna place a few of those. Now we click back on our domain. We have to bake it again. I'm not gonna bake it in the same resolution because it's gonna take again for a very long time. Let's keep it small, 64, and click on bake. Great, on 64 already it doesn't look too bad, but the higher the resolution, the better it's gonna look in the end, so keep that in mind. So now the smoke interacts with our ground, it bounces off basically, and it's also true for our little cubes. So that's a cool way to split up the smoke a little. You can even make those invisible for the camera, but they still interact with the smoke, which can be very cool for a little turbulence in specific areas. But that's basically it. Now I'm gonna bake the same thing in a higher resolution, and then we can play with the lights a little, and then I can give you a few pointers what to do there. Okay, this is our smoke now. We have no lights in the scene. Now we don't have any lights in the scene, so it's completely black. That's perfect, that's what we want. So if you ever watch smoke, and it's very important to observe those things, but if you ever seen smoke, it reacts best if the smoke is backlit. That always looks the best. If I just point a light directly at it, let's do that real quick, that's what it looks like. But if I place the same light right behind it, that's what it's gonna look like. So what you want to do is having definitely lights behind it, whatever lights it might be. You can use sunlight. In that case, I use spotlights, but that should be fine. You can even just use an HDR, then it's going to look like this. But the more light you have, the more details you need. And one important thing, really after it's baked, not before. After it's baked, you select your mesh, you just turn it completely off. So now our smoke dude is just smoke. If you keep it on, you still can see your model. You don't want that. You only want to see the smoke. So you go to your mesh and turn all those three things off. But let's remove our HDRI. We don't want it. Let's try to do this with our viewport. So first I need to figure out what kind of camera angle I want. Let's turn on all the lights so we can see better. what camera angle. Let's say I want something like a little down angle, like let's say here. That's pretty cool. Let's play with the camera angle. It's the focal length is 24 millimeters. That's pretty cool. Now our guy is sneaking through our little buildings here. Okay, one important thing is when you want to get the full power out of this effect, you go to your render properties, scroll down to your light paths. It's very important to have a lot of transmission and transparency just to see fully through. Let's do 10 here and transparent also 10. That's definitely going to make a huge difference, so don't neglect those two values here. Now in our notes here, again, we can play with the density, how dense we want it. We go crazy on 100, then it's way denser if we only go like on 10. It's not as dense if we go even lower than that. 1, it's like almost like a ghost, which is also very cool. But let's go with something like 50 here. And now the smoke's going to bounce to the ground. Looks pretty sick. But now, let's set our lights properly. I want one light, like a rim light right behind him, towards the camera. Let's do the same thing with the other one. We can make the shadows softer if we increase the radius of our light. Let's give it like maybe a cold tone. And let's have one area light right in front of it just to light up the entire scene a little. Now I'm going to animate my camera a little, so it's going to follow him while he's walking. So I'm going to go to the very first frame. On the top I can always see the angles he's looking at him. So this is where I start. Hit N. Go to item because I have my camera selected right now. Hover over location, hit I. I just made a keyframe. Go to the last frame and go up here and hit I again. You see the smoke is all over the place because I didn't bake for 200 frames yet, but I'm gonna do that in a second. But after I made those two keyframes, I go to linear, so it just goes from 1. It just follows him until here. Cool. So now I have to bake it one more time for 200 frames because this is how long I want my animation to be. I can already select it here, 200 frames. And one more thing I'm gonna do, because I don't want the simulation to start when the animation starts. I want, because when you look at the very first frame, you can already see still that he's like a human shape. But I want the simulation to start a little earlier, let's say 10 frames before. Now here, under frame start, I'm gonna start at -10. I'm gonna end at 200. That's how long I need this bake to be. And one more thing I like to do, since this is a smoky guy, I like to give the entire scene volumetric. That means I'm gonna make a cube, mesh, cube, bring it up, and I'm gonna scale it throughout the scene until it's big enough. I'm just gonna go to my last frame wherever the camera is gonna be. The camera is here, so I know kind of how long I need it to be. And now I'm gonna give this a new material. I'm gonna delete the principal. I'm gonna add the volume scatter. Hook this up with the volume. Here, it's like 0.6. Here 0.01, and now my entire scene has volume. That means I added haze in my scene and it just looks more cinematic. So now I'm gonna render my thing one more time, make sure the frames are right, then I'm gonna bake it all, and once it's all rendered, that's the result. So I hope that was all clear and easy to understand. If you have any questions, make sure to ask me in the comments below, and see you in the next video. Doo-doo.